I had the pleasure of meeting Iulian at the Learn Launch conference in Boston earlier this year, and really just appreciated what he had to say about augmented reality and mixed reality, especially because he takes an approach that's a little bit different than just focusing on the tech itself. Really focuses on more of the learning and what students are going to get out of it. So really excited to see who's in the room today, because I think we're going to get a lot out of what he has to say. Just a quick public service announcement. We are doing a live stream. That's what this video is for over here. So at the end of Iulian's presentation, he's going to leave about 15 minutes for Q&A. But when we do the Q&A, in order for the folks on the live stream to hear, you need to use this box. And we're going to throw it around. It's super fun. Try not to let it land in the lasagna. But in order for the folks to hear, you do need this. So it's going to be a kind of a weird... It feels a little weird for you to have to catch this before you can ask a question, but please try to do that so we can get the folks on there to hear. All right. Well, so without further ado, Iulian, thanks so much for being here. Really excited to hear more about what you have to say.
Cool. It's a pleasure to be here. Can you all hear me? You can hear me. Yeah, great. Thank you. It's really great to be here. I'm pretty honored to be invited to this space, and I also really love this space, I have to say. I don't think I've ever given a presentation in such a nice, playful space, so it's really great. So I'm here to talk to you about augmented reality and mixed reality in uses for education. Just a bit of background about me. I'm currently a postdoc researcher at Harvard in the Graduate School of Education. I co-instruct courses on digital fabrication, and I'm involved in researching collaborative learning and how we can use technologies to improve collaborative learning in makerspaces. And that does involve a bit of physics education, which I'm going to talk to you about also. My background is very technical in terms of, so my background is in computer science, and I love tinkering with things, and I love building things. My interest is more in kind of researching what we can do with technologies and finding good uses for it. So I did a PhD at Georgia Tech focused on using augmented reality for children and how to design usable augmented reality applications for kids, and also how to make them educational. And then afterwards, before going to Harvard, I worked for a company working in medical education with augmented reality and virtual reality. So I kind of have this path of being a really technical person who is interested in design and engineering, but also want to make sure that whatever I'm doing is being used for a good purpose. And I feel like education is really exciting and really useful to apply these technologies for education to transform how we basically educate people in our societies. And so today I have quite a bit of content. We'll see how much we get to. Hopefully I can cover a lot of these topics, but basically I want to give you an introduction to augmented reality, and then talk about when augmented reality could be useful for education, then how to design usable technologies and experiences for young users, which is something that I've done as my PhD, and then finally about how can augmented reality support constructivist education, such as education in makerspace environments, which is what I'm currently doing. And so just a quick introduction to augmented reality and mixed reality. I like to use this spectrum as an example. So is there a laser pointer here? Yes. So on the left-hand side here, basically this is a spectrum going from reality to virtual reality. So on the left-hand side is the reality that we physically inhabit. So it's us playing with very physical experiences. And then on the right side is these mediums that we've been able to create with virtual reality, where you can put something on your head and then you are completely immersed in a virtual world interacting with virtual content. And then in the middle, there's this space which is called mixed reality, which is a blend of virtual content and real world content. So augmented reality is on this side, where basically you can take a physical object and then add some holograms to it in order to learn about that physical object or to integrate the holograms into the real world. And then there's also on the right side here, there's something called augmented virtuality, where you're in a virtual world, but then you take some real content and you put it there, such as a video stream of a real person from the real world that you can see in a virtual space. And just to be clear, so augmented reality also there's many different versions of augmented reality. There's some experiences that are really tightly coupled to reality. So this is an example that I'll show you in a second, which is about taking physical objects and adding holograms on top of them. So in that case, the virtual content is really tightly tied to the physical object that is in front of the user. And then there's things that are more loosely coupled, such as this is Pokemon Go, which is a game, and you can basically play it anywhere you are in the world. The virtual content doesn't really have anything to do. It doesn't even pretty much know what the real world is around you. And so in that case, it's pretty loosely coupled in that the virtual content is pretty separate from the real world. So I just want to give you a sense of the different kinds of experiences that people have done with educating through augmented reality. So in this example, this is it's a physics system that I'm currently working on at Harvard. And what it is it's a large-scale version of a speaker. So a speaker basically makes sounds that you hear. And the way it works is there's a smartphone, and that smartphone basically, the energy from that smartphone when it's playing music gets amplified, and then all that electrical energy goes through these wires. And it turns out there's this phenomenon in physics where if you have electricity going through a wire, it creates a little magnetic field around it. And so if you coil that wire many, many times, you can magnify the magnetic field. So when you play music through a wire, you can create this alternating magnetic field that can then move an actual physical object that has a magnet attached to it. And so that's how sound works. So let me show you what that looks like. So in this case, we've built a physical system. And this is an experience that happens in a makerspace where people are basically wearing these headsets. And these are kind of like virtual reality headsets, except that they're transparent. So what they can see through them is physical objects with holograms on top of them. So there's a physical system in which basically there's a cup, and when you play music through it, the cup generates music. So it basically generates sound. And there's a problem that if you get students to practice this, to build this kind of system, they build it, but they don't really understand what's going on underneath it. So we basically built, this is the same physical system, but now you're seeing virtual content on top of it. So when you're looking at it, you can basically push buttons, and you can see a visualization of the music, the audio waves that are coming out of it. You can also see electricity that is going through the wires, and you can also see like a graphics of showing you what the current is like. And you can also see magnetic fields. For example, the coil of wires and the magnet that is attached to the cup. There's magnetic fields that are interacting with each other, and while you're physically moving it, the magnetic fields and electricity are being displayed so that you can actually understand what you're learning about. And so there's some really interesting visualizations that you can get to where you're seeing the shapes of the fields under different conditions. So as music is playing, they're alternating back and forth. And you can push buttons, and in response to the buttons that you're pushing, the physical system is moving. But also you're seeing these visualizations of what the invisible physics phenomena are behind the scenes. And so we're investigating of whether this kind of visualization is useful for helping people learn in these kind of spaces. The other thing we can do is, for example, if you have multiple devices, so another person is wearing one of these headset devices, you can also show lines of sight from the collaborators. So you can improve the collaboration by showing where another person is looking. So for example, I can see now that the other person's looking on the board at specific things, or they're looking at specific physical objects. And so this sort of being able to measure where the other person is looking can help with the collaboration. And the system is very physically interactive. So you can, for example, change different pieces of it, and then you can visualize what happens if you had a different kind of coil in the system. How does the magnetic field change in relation to that? And then we can also do things like measure where people are looking. So we can have eye trackers in these devices. Oh, sorry, that was super quick. That are measuring where people are looking. So in this case, we can measure live how the collaboration is happening. And we can also get people to basically, we can also understand what each person is looking at, and that helps them to collaborate around virtual content. So this was an example of physics education. And there's many other kinds of educational applications that have been built. So this is physics, basically looking at understanding physical phenomena. People have done things in biology. For example, this is an example from Case Western Reserve University, where they're visualizing different parts of human anatomy. And it's very useful to have this technology because you can look around from different angles and understand the physiology of people. This is another project from the University of Melbourne, where they're actually projecting by anatomy on a real person. And as the person is moving, the anatomy is adapting to their movements. And you can also annotate it. So it's very useful for educating people about what is happening within structures. So seeing through space, basically. Another way of seeing through space is there's applications in architecture where, for example, in this case, it's more construction where you're about to dig into, let's say, a city street, but you need to understand how the pipes are organized. So there's a way of bringing that kind of information into the physical space as somebody's watching a street, and you can basically look and understand where you should be digging. Another example from architecture is, for example, when there's a construction being built, you can use this technology to look into the future. So you can look at how the building is going to look in the future. Or another example of looking within things is, for example, like I could be looking at this room and I could be seeing what the internal structure of the pipes are. Or if we want to remodel the space, I could have a device that's looking around and I could understand how the space would look like if we were to change it. So there's kind of interesting ways of looking through space and looking through time. Another way of looking through time is people have built these experiences for history. For example, for when you're traveling, you can be in a physical site and you can understand how the ruins that you're looking at, how they used to look before, or how a physical artifact used to look before in the context. People have used it for any kinds of experiences where you need to understand spatially what's happening. So in this case, these are large-scale representations of chemical molecules, and as you're moving them around, they actually interact with each other, and you can understand how chemical molecules are repelling or attracting. So you get a physical understanding of that. There's also other examples of people who have done, for example, chemistry laboratories, where I could be simulating a virtual laboratory right here, where I could be taking chemicals and mixing them together without fear of things catching on fire or exploding or stuff like that. And if they do, I could push the stop button and undo button and basically redo the whole experiment. So it's really useful for that, basically being able to simulate things with low risk. And then people also use it for designing things. So in this case, this is a physical design environment where these folks are building a physical system, but that's kind of virtual, and they can simulate physics and forces. This is another example from currently from MIT, in which on the right side, they basically have a robot that is kind of 3D printing an object. And on the left-hand side, a person is basically watching. So this person is watching through a headset the robot, and they're also adapting the design as the robot is building it. So in this case, it's a very rapid way of prototyping things, where you're building things and also manipulating them at the same time. But we can get even into more abstract things, such as in mathematics. These are two examples of things that I was part of building. So on the left-hand side is a game. You can create these very spatial, three-dimensional games to teach children about, for example, spatial reasoning, or how shapes fit into each other, or things like that. So I'll show you a video of that. So this is a product. I was the lead designer and product manager of this while working at PBS Kids. And it's basically a game for children. And so they look at a piece of paper, and then they're doing these physical motions of moving around in space while solving problems, such as solving geometric kind of puzzles. This is a very simple level, but it kind of shows you the core of the activity. So a child would be sitting around in a table and they would be moving around while manipulating these geometric pieces. And that kind of trains them to think spatially about things. It also teaches them many different things about shapes fitting together, geometry, things like that. And then on the right is another example of, so the examples that I've been showing you have been quite spatial, but in this case, you can also teach more abstract things like algebra. So in this case, I've built this prototype where I have Lego blocks, and by connecting and disconnecting the Lego blocks, you can actually see different kinds of equations that form. So in this case, it's four green things plus 3 yellow things. They make seven, like the addition of 4 and 3 makes 7. And you can imagine that by physically manipulating that, you can get a physical understanding of what numbers are and how to put numbers together, how to break numbers apart. Kind of more abstractly, there's applications for language learning. So in this case, you might be in a situation where you need to understand what something means. And so this is an actual application from, it's called Google Lens. And you can basically point it at signs in your environment, and it translates them for you. And so it's really useful because you get this information in the context that you're in, and you can learn about that. And then, I hope nobody's disturbed by this, but so you can also use it for therapy learning, where, for example, like behaviorally exposure therapy of, for example, this person might have a phobia about specific kinds of ants crawling on them, and so you can create virtual ants, and they would be crawling on you. So it's sort of a type of learning in the sense that you're changing the way the brain works. I'm not sure what that, what that. Oh, that's great. More visitors in the audience. Going with the roaches. So I just wanted to super quick give you a sense of the hardware that's involved. So you can do augmented reality on anything that involves a display and a camera. So before, people have been doing it on computers that have webcams. So you can have a webcam that is looking at a physical object, and then on the screen you can display some augmentation or holograms around it. And then people have been using it a lot with smartphones and tablets, just because smartphones and tablets have cameras on them, so you can use them as kind of magic lenses to look at the world and see extra stuff. But nowadays, there's been kind of an explosion of hardware that's being put on people's heads. So the problem with the previous approaches is that you're kind of either stuck at a computer or you're stuck looking at the holograms through a screen. But now you can actually wear things on your head, which are basically kind of like sunglasses, except that they're highly advanced lenses, and there's projectors in them that basically allow you to just look at the world and see the visualizations around you. Yeah, so there's a variety of those. And there's some variety of authoring software, although the landscape is quite limited. The most popular, I think, are these development environments like Unity 3D or Unreal Engine, which basically allow you to create, they're basically game engines that allow you to create virtual games. And so people have created augmented reality libraries that you can use to develop games that use augmented reality. And then there's some environments like HP Reveal, Aurasma, and Blipar, which are more aimed at kind of everyday users. So they're web-based environments where you just go to a website, you upload some media, and you tell your device how to trigger that media. They're not so complicated in terms of what you can do in comparison to Unity 3D or Unreal, but they're a more easy entry point. And once a while ago, I also created an authoring environment for children to create augmented reality. So it was based on the MIT Scratch environment, which is plug and play. And then I basically put a camera in it, and I allowed children to create augmented reality using these sort of things. And there's a link to it. I'm not sure how well it still works on the newer hardwares, but I'm happy to chat with you more about that if you're interested. And then there are also a set of libraries. So if you are a programmer and you don't want to use these existing authoring environments, you can just download the libraries and integrate them into your code. So there's libraries that do tracking of actual images. There's libraries that allow you to just track as you move around in a physical space. So there's quite a wide variety. Yep. OK. And then the second thing I want to chat with you about is when investigating when is augmented reality useful for education. So this is a question that I became interested in while I was doing my PhD and also working at PBS Kids, is understanding why should we design with this technology? Like, why is it actually useful? Another way of asking this question is, why does this need to be augmented reality? Which I think is a really important question you should think about whenever you see augmented reality products, or whenever you think about a problem that you're having, is how does this take advantage of the unique affordances of augmented reality? And so when you think about how learning happens, we have a lot of experiences which people have built for doing simulations on computers. So basically learning through computer screens. And computer screens are very useful. There's a lot of useful factors to it. We can build simulations that are two-dimensional on screens. We can also simulate 3D content on screens. We can combine many different kinds of representations while we're looking at a computer screen. We can make them interactive, so people are actively learning with them by playing with them. Students can get feedback on what they're thinking about. They could be very personalized. So computer simulations are already extremely powerful. They can do a lot of things. So the question is, what does augmented reality add to this? So one thing that I feel it adds is that you're not just learning through your head and your eyes, you're now learning with your body. So you're immersed in you're surrounded by holograms or 3D content. And that basically connects to a more primal part of the brain, where you can feel things more strongly. So you feel like you're immersed in something, you'll feel like you're present with the objects around you. That kind of gives you a different way of thinking about what you're experiencing. It's also kinesthetic, so you can use your body to interact and physically move while you're experiencing content. You can take advantage of gestures or large-scale movements. So there's lots of kind of new channels that are being activated when you're designing with these kind of technologies, as compared to just the computer-based simulations. And so something that I wanted to talk to you about is the research I did while I was at PBS Kids. We collaborated with an organization called Wested Research. And so basically we were interested in understanding what's at this intersection of what do educators want, like what do educators desire to be built in terms of their needs, and also what is technically possible, and also what's viable in terms of the business models. And so there were kind of two main questions that we looked at. One is, how is augmented reality different from other traditional mediums? Because we were trying to understand what is it special about this technology and how can we design with it. And then the second thing was what kind of mathematics topics should be addressed, because we were really interested in targeting mathematics. And so the methods that we did literature analysis, looking at research that compared augmented reality to non-augmented reality. We did interviews and focus groups, surveys talking to teachers, and a lot of prototyping involving teachers. And some of the outcomes were, we got some publications about understanding the design affordances of this technology for education, what it's good for, what it's not good for, and a list of difficulties that teachers had with the Common Core State Standards curriculum, and also understanding of how some prototype games might be built for that. And so in this talk, I just want to talk to you a little bit about how augmented reality is different from the traditional mediums for that question. And so from this research came this list of affordances that augmented reality brings that are kind of different from other mediums. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about each one of these. So the first one is that it provides us with the ability to create interactive 3D simulations. And this is really good for active learning because it basically allows somebody to move around and understand something that is three-dimensional that might be maybe complicated to express in a two-dimensional form, such as on a textbook or on a screen. And the fact that it's interactive is also very useful because you're now physically interacting with something that is three-dimensional, and so that allows you to learn about it much more effectively than, let's say, if you're using a mouse. Another reason is that there are multiple representations that you can align in the same space. So for example, if you're learning about physical objects, you can take information that you have about the inner workings of those objects, or for example, in this case, we're looking at magnetic fields around coils. So you can take those representations that are sometimes found in textbooks or on videos, and you can overlay them on top of the physical objects. And that is a great benefit, because now the learner can just basically look at one thing and get all this information integrated into it. Another good reason is that it's contextual. So information comes exactly when the learner needs it. So in this example, it's an existing application that allows you to look at mathematics formulas, and you kind of scan them, and the system solves them for you. And you can imagine similar things about vocabulary learning, or kind of walking around the street and trying to understand what things mean, or in a supermarket trying to understand how many calories are on the shelf, or things like that. So very useful to get information in the context that you're in. From an educational perspective, it's also important to be not skeptical, but to be really aware of, is this good or is it bad? Sometimes you might not want to actually give a lot of information in the context. So there's different things to consider. Another related topic is directing the user's attention. So in this case, it's more of an industrial setting where somebody's walking around and they're kind of getting this information to understand what the machinery around them is doing and thinking about. But also with the system, you can direct them to pay attention to something very specific. And this is something that a teacher might do, or some sort of mentor or a technician might do. But for somebody who's novice, the system can basically direct their attention in the physical environment. So from this perspective, it's very useful. It's also kinesthetic, so you can use your body to interact with things. By physically manipulating things, it's possible to get a sort of an intuitive sense of the content that you're interacting with. So there's research that's showing that performing certain gestures is actually helpful to remember things or to understand things in a different way. It's also personally meaningful, so that, for example, you can bring in your own content into the experience. So you can bring in your own toys, or you can look at the things around in your world, and that basically creates a very deep personal connection between the experience that you're having and the learning that's going on. And it also allows a new way of collaboration. So, for example, these folks have these old devices on their heads that are allowing them to be in the same space together, talk to each other, but at the same time, they're manipulating virtual content. So instead of looking at a screen and manipulating the content on the screen without easily looking at each other, now you can have virtual content and physical content and other people that you're interacting with. So it sort of provides a new way of collaborating around virtual content. And then last but not least, it's highly motivational. And this might be just kind of a passing trend, but it's still active, that when people experience these kind of things, they get highly motivated and excited about them. And I'll talk about this in a bit too. So it's very important to think about all these different dimensions whenever you're evaluating an existing product, or when you're thinking about whether a problem that you're having could be fit for this kind of technology. And the other thing that I did is I converted these into more like a heuristic questionnaire, which is about asking these kind of questions in order to help you design more easily. So whenever you see something, you could ask, does this experience allow me to see spatially complex 3D phenomena, or transform the representations in a way that I can more easily learn? Or could I design an AR experience in which somehow I bring in information at the right time and space, which could be really helpful for people? So one thing that we did is, from the other part of this research, is by talking to teachers, we basically found out these list of problems that they were having in the mathematics curriculum common state standards. And then we figured how difficult were certain topics, and then whether or not augmented reality could be fit for them. And some interesting things came out. For example, in this top right example is taking advantage of context. So we have a worksheet in which there's some questions that students get asked in mathematics class. And if they're struggling, they could have a device which they point at the worksheet, and then it basically illustrates what the problem is for them. So it kind of acts it out for them. So that's a way of bringing in notation and vocabulary and word problems connected to this technology. Another way was, for example, children had some problems using non-standard measurement. And so we built a prototype in which kids would actually have to perform physical activities to measure something. And if they weren't doing them properly, this virtual puppy would basically guide them along. So a way of integrating this technology into tackling some of these problems. And also at the same time, we built this game that I showed you before, which is basically training spatial thinking skills. And so you can download the game if you're interested. It's called Cyberchase Shape Quest. It won a bunch of awards, and there was several publications. If you're more interested in this research, I will happily share these slides with you. And then something else that I want to talk about is how to design these kind of technologies for young users. So it's really exciting to be able to bring these technologies to young users. I feel like there's a lot of educational opportunities, especially working with early elementary school, because children are at a stage where they move from physically interacting with toys in their world to learning about more abstractions about the world. And so in early elementary school, it seems like a great area for bringing this technology. For example, creating augmented learning objects or different kinds of learning experiences for children. And also, there's technologies developing so that mobile devices are broadening access for kids into education, and there's a lots of interest of hardware and educational organizations to be able to bring these technologies for kids. And so I was interested in these things as part of my PhD also, and so I built a lot of different prototypes, and I was really excited about being able to educate with this technology. But something that I ran into is problems with children's developing skills. So, for example, in this case, there's some graphs of these are adults moving a mouse from point A to point B repeatedly. And these are children. You can't really see. There's actually more squiggly lines on my desktop. But it's basically a lot of squiggles from 5-year-old children being able to manipulate a physical device to move from point A to B. So this is an example of research that's been done looking at physical manipulation and how that differs between adults and children, because children's skills are different. There's also another set of research that's been done with this water conservation task, where if you fill these two glasses with water, and then you take the rightmost one and you pour it into a taller glass, and then you ask if children are very young, they will tell you that the glass on the right has more water, just because it's they're thinking in terms of perceptually rather than abstract thinking. So there's skills that are changing as children get older, and what that means is that if we don't take those skills into account and we just design experiences, we might, there's certain skills that are required in the technology, and poor usability is actually going to be a problem, in that it's going to be difficult to create those experiences, but also it's going to be difficult for children to use them if they don't have the skills needed. And if they can't use those experiences, they're going to be frustrated. They won't use the products that you design. But also, most importantly, they won't be able to engage with the educational content that's underneath it, because they'll just have problems using the application and not be able to actually engage in education. So the research questions that I tackled as part of my PhD were things like, what kind of problems arise when children use these technologies? What are the underlying reasons for these problems? And how can we design better things so that children can use them? So the methods for this are building lots of prototypes, doing user studies, interviews, experiments, and then designing a framework for thinking about children's skills. And so from these different prototypes and interactions with children, I basically came up with this these different lens of understanding the different kind of skills that are involved in designing these technologies. And I focused on children using smartphones And so when using smartphones, I have a smart one. Basically, there's lots of different skills, such as being able to manipulate the device, so being able to hold it in a comfortable fashion for long periods of time, being able to interact with it. So there's different things you can design in the interaction that will make it either harder to use or easier to use for young children. There's things about spatial understanding, such as, here. So manipulation things are things like, are children going to be able to precisely touch things or to move around the space, or will they be able to hold the device for a prolonged period of time? There's things to think about in terms of spatial understanding from children's perspective, of when you have a little lens like this, my screen is pretty small, and so there might be virtual content in front of me that I'm looking at, but there might also be some virtual content around me, some holograms that I'm not currently seeing on the screen, but I have to kind of remember and keep track of. So there's these spatial thinking skills that are required to be able to understand how to interact with these devices. And also, if you're requiring, for example, people to move in and out or to do certain kind of gestures manipulating the space, they need to have a certain understanding of that spatial information. And then there's also things related to attention. So, for example, there's been these problems reported about kids, even in my studies actually, children having to do a certain task, but then they kind of lose track of the real world. They're so focused, their attention is so focused on what they're doing in that they bump into the objects that are around them. This can actually be a problem for when you're doing things on the street, when you're doing games outside, because kids can trip or bump into other people or traffic or things like that. So it's important to be conscious of their attention skills. And also there's things related to abstract thinking, such as with this technology, the one I was using, it required a piece of paper in order to anchor the virtual holograms. And whenever that paper would be lost, there's certain ways of aiming at the paper which would recover the technology's ability to use it. But those kind of things actually require children to have a certain understanding of the space and the experience. There's also other kinds of abstract thinking skills, such as, do children understand when you're looking at holograms, do they understand them as something that's in the world, or do they understand them as just something that's on the screen itself? And so there's quite a variety of sort of factors that come into play, especially when you're designing not for adults, so for people who are developing. And also, this is some data from quantitative data that I've collected about children between 5 and 10 years old, split into 3 groups, so 5 and 6, 7, 8, and 9 and 10. And it turned out that the young kids, 5 and 6-year-olds, are significantly different than the 7, 8, and 9 and 10 in terms of their speed at being able to complete things, the number of problems that they were having. So it was quite a big gap between that age, between 5 and 6-year-olds and the rest. Overall, the children's problems got less and less. Although there were some problems that started coming up more in older children, in that they were kind of, because their bodies were larger, and so when they're interacting with something, they tended to have very strange postures, and that was kind of a problem that we observed. And then basically, some of these skills were correlated to developmental skills. So in developmental psychology, there's literature about people's motor development, fine motor skills, hand-eye coordination, things like that, or spatial cognition. So there's people that have researched these skills, and that they can say at what age does a certain skill come into play and how to design around it. And so in my PhD thesis, I actually made this long list of design guidelines. So if you're interested in designing for children, feel free to visit this website. And so in there, I have broken down on different ages and the kind of tips and tricks, the problems that kids had, and how to address them in designing applications. OK, so I'm going to super quickly run through this last thing, because I want to have some time for questions and answers. But the last thing I wanted to chat with you about is looking at makerspaces. And so how can augmented reality support constructionist education? So constructionism is a theory pioneered by Seymour Papert and other people, which basically states that when people are physically constructing artifacts, that is extremely helpful for learning, because when you're physically constructing something, you're solving certain kinds of problems that you are also very interested in because you're physically constructing something, and it's also a very social activity because you get to construct something, work as part of a team, present that to other people. And so there's a lots of kind of soft 21st century skills that get developed in these kind of environments, like perseverance against problems that you're having as you're building something, teamwork, communication, leadership, thinking outside the box, very many different kinds of skills that are nurtured in makerspace environments. So as part of my work at Harvard, I'm looking at how technology, especially this kind of augmented reality technology, can be used to enhance this kind of learning in makerspaces. And I've also co-instructed a course on designing physical objects and digital fabrication for education. And so one of the things that we were interested in is to understand, so when people are building things, sometimes they are just following instructions without really understanding what's going on behind the scenes. So one of the things we were interested in is, what if we take the objects that people are constructing with and we can add extra information on them? Such as if we can show electricity or show magnetic fields or audio waves, or we can take sensors that people are using to construct digital artifacts, so things that involve electronics, and we can visualize them. So one of the projects was the one that I've just shown you, where people are constructing a physical speaker, and we're showing all these physical phenomena by being able to visualize them. Another one is this project, which we are currently building on being able to visualize live sensor values. Whoops. So in this example, we built a system in which so somebody has built a robot, and the robot has several sensors on it. And so this is a sensor that measures proximity to things. On the other side, there's also another sensor that measures proximity to things. And then there's a magnetic field sensor on the bottom that can sense if there's a magnet nearby. And so in this case, you're looking at the physical object, and you're understanding what that robot is sensing and thinking about. And in this case, you can also watch it. So right now, it's nearby a wall. And as soon as it starts working, it detects that the wall has disappeared. So you can see that on the graph. And you can also detect that a magnetic field is underneath it. And so we're exploring basically being able to use this technology as people are constructing things. How is this useful, and how is it changing the way they learn collaboratively? And so our research questions are things like, what effect does augmented reality have on learning or collaboration or STEM attitudes towards STEM? The way we do it is we have very controlled experiments with multiple experimental conditions. We ask people about their knowledge before and after the study. We also ask them about their attitudes towards science or towards their experience. We look at how they're collaborating and rate that. And also we look at continuous metrics, such as, so we have these position sensors, so we can tell people's postures and how that's changing over time while they're doing the activity. And we also have electrodermal activity, basically bracelets that can measure if people are physiologically aroused or excited or scared or things like that. And so by looking at those, we can look at how the collaboration is unfolding in real time. But at the same time, we can measure before and after the effects. And so I'm just going to quickly run through this. So some of the preliminary findings are that when people have this augmented reality visualizations, they take advantage of them. And so sometimes there's an imbalance between somebody knows a lot more than, so there's two people, one person knows a lot more than the other person. But because they have these visualizations at their disposal, the person who knows more can point at things and kind of use that information to teach the other person things that they might not otherwise be able to communicate. They also use it for hypothesis testing, where they might have an idea of how something happens, and then they try it out and they watch what happens. And because they have these representations, that makes it much easier to have these cycles of forming questions and answering them. And that also reduces the ambiguity between their communication. And something that just keeps coming up is people reporting that whenever they see these kind of visualizations, they feel like they would have learned much better in physics. So we get quotes like this, like 5th graders, 4th graders, they're in for a treat. I wish they had this when I was their age. I definitely probably would have gone into physics instead of finance. So we noticed that people get really excited about it. And so this is a graph in which basically we have 4 different conditions. The bottom one, which is the dark gray one, is not using any device on their head. So people are just looking at the physical system. And the other ones are people either wearing the HoloLens device and seeing holograms, or just wearing it and seeing like very little bit, just labels on the physical setup. So some of these groups, they wear something on their heads, but they don't actually see too much. They don't see electricity, they don't see magnetic fields, things like that. But even those groups, they get really excited. So those are the HoloLens non-augmented reality, which is the purple. And you can see that their interest is really high. They still feel involved as the other people who are wearing and exposed to a lot more augmented reality. So just wearing this technology creates a sense of excitement. And it's interesting because some of this actually changes how people think about their own skills. And it's sometimes not related to how much they're learning, which is really interesting. So sometimes people get excited, but they might not be learning as much. It does turn out that for some things, for example, for some transfer questions, people in the group, in certain augmented reality groups, they learn more than the people who don't have the representations, which are the last 2 groups here. But for other things, augmented reality might not be good. So there's certain topics in which the people who don't wear anything on their head and don't see anything, they actually do better than the augmented reality groups. So for some things, it's actually useful not to have the augmented reality. So sometimes the augmented reality can give you sort of an illusion that you're seeing everything and you're understanding everything, and that it can make you feel excited about learning, but it actually might not be teaching you things. Like, it might be useful to actually not show augmented reality and force people to think about what they're looking at, and then maybe show them the augmented reality. So there's this interesting thing that happens with scaffolding where sometimes it's important to not give people the answers through this technology. It's useful to have them think about things and sort of struggle with things a little bit, and then show them the answer to allow them to kind of verify and to learn if they haven't learned something, and then possibly even take that away at the end, just so that people are actually really deeply thinking about the content instead of using the augmented reality as a sort of shortcut to get answers. So I think that's one of the interesting things that is coming out of this, that too much augmented reality can actually be detrimental in that sometimes people feel overwhelmed, they're not paying attention to things, but sometimes people feel like they have all the answers and they're just on the post-test, they actually haven't internalized what they saw. So it's very important to think about how much augmented reality you're showing and at what time you're showing it. So in terms of conclusions, it's important to leverage the unique affordances of this technology to understand the different dimensions that we can design with. It's important to have to understand that it's a complex interface, and so it needs to match the abilities of the users. So when designing, you need to design with the users in mind. You need to involve them in rapid feed prototyping, also the teachers and other stakeholders. Motivation is important to have, and these experiences will generate a lot of motivation, but that might not translate into knowledge gains. So it's important to be careful about that too. And it's also important to design with scaffolding and fading, so that you're giving information, but only when people need it. And then, so there's some things that I'm excited about, but I feel like I will quickly tell you. So some things are, there's tight integration. So there's people who are working on technology that allows us to detect physical objects and to track physical objects. And so I'm really excited about being able to merge the digital information that we have with more and more physical spaces and physical environments and physical objects. I also see an interesting growth of machine learning and personalized content where you can have these experiences and there's going to be a lot of adaptation while somebody is experiencing things like this. The computer can be monitoring what the student is doing. It can be assessing them while they're interacting with something. It can also adapt the experience to that. And I think that's going to create some shifts in the way we teach. Because now people are going to be spending a lot of time in these experiences, and the experiences are going to go in different ways for different learners. So it's interesting to think about how pedagogically we can change our practices to support that kind of thing. And the other thing that I'm really excited about is the fact that we can use these technologies to involve people's bodies. So we can create experiences in which people are learning things while doing certain physical gestures that might intuitively relate to the content that they're learning about. Or we can use them for assessment, where we can design experiences in which people are moving things in a certain way, and by monitoring how people are moving, we can actually assess how much they know about a certain topic. So yeah, I'll skip over this. But thank you. So this is my email address. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions or if you want to continue this conversation. I'm currently at Harvard at least until the end of August, when my postdoc is finishing. If any of you know about any sort of related work in this field or any opportunities to collaborate together, I would be happy to talk to you. And then that's my website in case you want to see other interesting stuff. Thank you.
If anybody has any questions before we use box.
Hi.
So have you heard of something called ThingWorks or LiveWorks?
Mm-hmm.
We're interested in using it with some of our 3D CAD designs that our students do, and then using it to kind of translate like you did with the physical object. They can see some of the inner workings through the AR app. Do you know what I'm talking about? Kind of?
Yes. So I know ThingWorks is like the company PTC.
Right.
Is one of their products. Although, and I guess you can design applications in which you're overlaying virtual content on real objects.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So my question is, in your research, have you come across any like engineering schools and how they would embed that into enhancing the comprehension of the students through some of the engineering design courses?
So I have sometimes run into those. It hasn't been my main focus, and so I haven't looked too deeply into that. But I know that design schools, it's extremely helpful when you're designing something to be able to just put it in the world around you and being able to analyze it as you're designing. So as you're creating 3D models, to be able to easily export them as holograms is a very useful method to have. Yeah. But I can certainly dig up some things if you're interested, and I can send that to you. Because I keep seeing people who are doing that kind of research, but very controlled research studies on people looking at architectural things or mechanical models of things.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
But I'd be happy to send you more.
What is your recommended path for learning how to be an AR developer? Is it go out and learn Unity and then buy a HoloLens SDK, or what do you do?
So I think it depends on how much programming expertise you have to begin with. If you don't have much programming expertise, I wouldn't suggest Unity, just because there's a lot of programming that you need to put in it to make things work. I would start with some of the easier ones, like the more web-based things. Or I'm not sure if ThingWorks is free to use, but like PTC has some applications also that you can easily upload models, like upload 3D models, and then you can put them on a piece of paper, like on a target, and you can kind of explore what you can do with that technology. So I would say that's a good starting step. And then going into Unity ideally, at some point, you would get into Unity. It's such a powerful platform, and it's quite easy to, if you have a little bit of background experience programming, it's C#. And once you get into it, it's quite easy to attach 3D models to images. So that experience is quite easy. And you can use Unity to deploy to different kinds of, to do different kinds of augmented reality. So in Unity, I believe by default nowadays, Unity comes with an augmented reality plugin. From PTC, actually, the Vuforia platform. And so that plugin can allow you to use your webcam on your computer to, you just have to print a piece of paper and you show it, and then you can overlay a digital model on it. So that's probably the easiest thing you can build. And then Unity also supports deploying through the other libraries that I listed. It supports deploying to smartphones. So you actually don't need any expensive device. As long as you have a smartphone, either Android or Apple, you can deploy from Unity the same project into the different platforms.
What was the first one you said, PTC?
So there's this library called Vuforia, which comes with, yeah, let me just pull up this slide because it's in here. Here. So the Vuforia library, whoops. This Vuforia library, if you visit that webpage, there's a plugin that comes for Unity. And I think at the very basic, you might be able to just put a 3D model on top of a printed piece of paper without programming anything. But if you want any sort of interaction, like if you click on it or you bring something else, you'll need to program a little bit. But yeah, I suggest starting maybe with Aurasma as sort of the really easy starting point. It will have some features and certain limitations, and then you can move into Unity. Unity has a lot of support for doing augmented reality, and a lot of deployment capabilities.
I'm curious to know, you did a lot of work around trying to understand when AR is the right tool to use for students. Have you come across any research or done any of your own research to understand how to best assess whether or not the student is actually learning when they use this technology versus something else?
So it's interesting because I think of assessment as not something that is tied to the technology. Like I can't, I'm not sure what it would mean to assess specifically for augmented reality. Like if you're trying to assess learning, there's approaches that you can use in many different mediums. So are you looking for kind of methods that are specifically made for augmented reality to assess in augmented reality, or are you?
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah, so I've seen people.
Is it different at all?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Like, would you have to develop something very specific about learning in augmented reality? Usually the kind of things that I've seen are people doing, let's say, pre and post tests, like knowledge tests, but those are done using paper. And so it doesn't matter, like the activity that people do in between those tests can be really varied. Like you can do an augmented reality experience and you compare that with pen and paper experience, compare it to virtual reality. So you can expose students to any kind of learning experience, but you can test them using the same methods of pen and paper tests at the beginning versus at the end, or interviews at the beginning and at the end. So people do that. There are some things that happen that are maybe harder to measure. For example, when you're using augmented reality or any kind of, I think, immersive media, people are going to do things that you can't really standardize between people. So I might, if I'm playing a game or doing some sort of learning experience here, I might move like this, and I might click on this, and I might explore it in a certain way, versus if somebody else were to do it, they might do something else. So there's ways to capture those individual learning trajectories by basically having the software to monitor, for example, which angle you're looking at the experience from, how have you moved around, what kind of things have you touched. And so from that you can sort of get a variety of what kind of diversity of motions or interactions people have done with the same experience. But it's interesting because I'm thinking about it, and you can do that with any kind of digital game or digital artifact. So it is with a game, let's say like a game that's played on a computer, maybe there's more constraints on what people can do, versus with augmented reality, people are more free because they're freely able to move around the space. They can interact with it in different ways. So there's some diversity that comes from that, and you can probably look at that and how augmented reality supports those kind of different kinds of diversities. But at the end of the day, I guess I've mostly seen people do paper knowledge tests or interviews or things like that, like ways to capture how much people know coming out of the experience. But I can
Thank you, Lisa. So to clarify, AR is typically done in order to create a learning experience, but not necessarily to use as an assessment in and of itself. Are there any situations where folks are using AR to assess specific skills, or?
Let me see if I can think of. So I'm.
So if you had like a predefined, a correct, a rule that you could establish in the system, so that the person engaging in the environment, depending on what their behavior was, would trigger whether or not they completed the task correctly or incorrectly, but using AR.
Yeah. So I've seen people do that for physical rehabilitation, where you have, let's say, it's an augmented environment where you're trying to kind of touch different parts. It's kind of like a gamified experience where you have virtual holograms that are popping in and out, and you have to kind of touch them. And so people use that to assess the physical skills of somebody, like if they have some sort of injury or things like that. They're doing it to assess what they can do, and I can see that being really useful because it's a very physical assessment, right? Like whenever you do those kind of things, it has to be a physical assessment, and you have to motivate people to do that. And so augmented reality is really suitable for that kind of thing. I've seen, not in augmented reality, but in virtual reality, being able to create an assessment environment. So for example, if you need people to take a test, instead of having them sit in a room surrounded by other people who are taking a test and teachers going up and down checking them, you can put a virtual headset on and you're on the beach in your favorite place. It's very relaxing, and you're taking the same test. And in that sense, the technology is sort of changing your environment so that you can be in a more relaxed state, so that the assessment is actually measuring the knowledge that you have, not your stress levels that you're experiencing.
I love that. Are you familiar with the social psychology study, That Swimsuit Becomes You?
No.
It would, I'll explain it to you later if we have the chance to connect.
Yeah. But yeah, it's an interesting, so I've also seen other research on, not in using augmented reality, but I've seen research on embodied cognition where, for example, they've studied children who are learning specific math operations. And so by looking at people's gestures, the way they gesture while they talk about something, you can actually tell more about what they know instead of just listening to how they're speaking. So listening to how they're speaking about something compared to listening to how they're speaking and how people are gesturing gives you more information. So there's cases where people are saying that they don't understand how something works, but they gesture in a way that indicates that they understand how something works. And in that sense, it can indicate kind of a transition, like a zone of proximal development kind of thing, where they're almost understanding something, but they're not able to conceptually verbalize it, but gesturally they're doing it. So there's some research on gesture that has looked at that, but I haven't seen anything in augmented reality that is about assessing people's gestures. But it does seem like a very promising environment.
That brings up a question about what type of feedback can these systems provide instructors to help them plan the next intervention or the next experience, or to provide the next support for students?
Yeah, and I think that's it's interesting because that question can be applied to so many different kinds of media, right? Like, teachers are always going to benefit from information, especially if technology can collect that information. Doesn't necessarily have to be augmented reality, but if you make technologies that can measure what people are doing and provide that to teachers, the teachers can actually enhance their practices. So, for example, the augmented reality experiences are they're very physical in that people are moving around, and so there's a few things that I can think of. In our studies, for example, we measure people's electrodermal activity and how, when you're doing a paired activity in a team, people's electrodermal signals, you can tell if they're actually in synchrony or not, so if they're synchronized or not. So that information can actually be useful for the participants themselves to know if the other person is kind of on the same page or not. It can also be useful for the teachers to understand if the collaboration went well or not. You can also use postures, like if you have a system that's monitoring postures, you can also tell things about the quality of collaboration. So if people are sort of oriented toward each other, or if they're mirroring each other's motions, that can tell you if they've collaborated well or not. And so if you have that kind of system that is tracking that, it could be an augmented reality system, but it could just be something that is monitoring people. So that could be useful for teachers too. Another thing that we're currently working on for example, in maker spaces, where it's kind of these big spaces where people use lots of different tools, and there's teams of people, sometimes individuals, that kind of are just milling around the space. By being able to monitor people as they move around the space, you can actually learn certain things, such as how often do they use a certain machine that can maybe tell you about their expertise levels, how often are they collaborating with somebody else, like oriented in the same way and talking to each other. So you can kind of develop these social network graphs that you can tell who is connected to who, and maybe who is an outlier. So as a teacher, you could use that information to say, hey, you haven't used the laser cutter too much, but this other person has, and I see you're not talking to each other too much, so go meet this person and learn from them. So you can use that as a teacher to kind of to help make those connections and to kind of monitor your classroom. But yeah, it's interesting because so you can create augmented reality experiences, and you can instrument them to monitor things. So for example, in the physics environment that I showed you, we can monitor how often people have changed the type of coil they're using, or how often they've looked at the magnet being far versus close. So all that information can go back to the teacher, and you can, as a teacher, you can see, okay, these people did not explore this, so maybe that's something for them to do. Something else that I think is interesting, being able to collect all this information as a teacher, it relates to the point that I had about personalized learning, that different students are going to take different trajectories. And I feel like with that kind of power, it's very helpful for students to be exploring things, but as a teacher, you should know how the students differ from each other at the end of the day. So I think it's important to kind of pull everybody back into a classroom and be able to look at the kind of interactions that they've had and be able to see some of you students have explored this topic. Others have explored this topic. Let's talk about the synergies between those. So I don't know if that makes sense, but it's basically a way of the problem of having people do individual learning trajectories is that they're going to be learning different things. But at the end of the day, you might want to get everybody on the same level. And so being able to monitor what they've learned is actually very helpful as a teacher, because you can then use that information to convey it to people who haven't done it.
So that brings up a follow-up question is, who's doing good work in terms of designing both for student experience and teacher experience, usability on both ends?
So I can point you to different researchers that have explored that. It's really hard to tell because I haven't seen too much of this technology be implemented in classrooms at scale. It's usually because it's pretty novel still, and I think there's a skepticism around it. It's sort of been researched in specific sort of environments. But I can certainly look at and point you at some papers. I can think of some that have involved teachers and students in designing things that both as a teacher, you get sort of like information from what the students are doing, and as the students, they have a different experience that they're having while they're learning. In terms of developing those kind of things, it is more complicated though, because you have to develop for both sides. Right, so you have to make really interesting experiences for the students, but also really useful experiences, like different kinds of interfaces for the teachers. So I can see why that might be. It's sort of underexplored right now.
I also just wanted to say that after this talk, Iulian's going to be sitting down with the folks at Sandbox and helping us think through how to build out our R&D lab. So if anybody wants to join us, you're not done with the conversation yet, please feel free to hang out.
Yeah.
So you were talking, this is a little bit more on the development side. You were talking about using Unity or Unreal, and you should have a little bit of programming background or some to do that, but as far as the content that's created, I know that Unity and Unreal has a marketplace that you can get stuff, but what about custom content? What do you suggest to someone who wants to do that? And there are 3D models that just aren't out there that they need created. What would be your approach for that?
Sorry, I didn't understand the last part. Did you say they're not created?
Yeah, so there's if I needed a turbine made, and I want to do something in AR, how would I get that turbine made, that 3D model? Because you're talking about, you do this and then it's a 3D model. How do you get that turbine?
So whenever I've collaborated with people to create new content, there have been some sort of graphic artists involved that were hired to do that. Yeah, so a lot of this content is three-dimensional models that have to be created by somebody to look good. And sometimes you might want something that doesn't exist on the existing marketplaces. I don't know of any. I mean, I know there's 3D modeling consultancy firm, like companies who you go and you tell them what you need, and they ship it back to you for a price. I'm not sure if something like that exists online. I've never done it, but I feel like it should be, because this kind of work can be done remotely. So there might be some websites which allow you to connect to people who are willing to do graphic design for very specific small content. There's also free-to-use software if you're interested to learn, although I've heard it's quite complicated to learn, especially if you want animated models. There's also design schools. So within universities, there's sometimes schools that are teaching people how to do 3D design. Sometimes in the schools of design or architecture. So those students would know. They might.
The only reason I ask is because I think it's the visual is such a big component of AR, right? And I think just so people understand too, is like the programming is a huge part of it, but unless you have that link that is the visual, it might not really give you the experience that you're looking for. And I know because someone was asking earlier, like, oh, what do you need to know? And I was like, oh, you probably should know some 3D or have someone there as well. That's why I was looking for your experiences, like what you've done in the past.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I should have mentioned it to him, that the 3D component, like if you're trying to do something brand new and really immersive and that does teach something, it's a lot of 3D modeling involved. I think a lot of the cost actually of like developing some of the products that I've made, the commercial products, a huge amount of the cost is actually just in the 3D modeling pipeline. Programming is also kind of complicated because you have to tie in all the 3D models together and make them interactive, but there's such a huge amount of 3D modeling work. So yeah, that is a big component of it, and I would be interested to know if there's a way of easily creating content. This is really
Well, thank you so much. Thanks so much, Iulian, for being here, and
Sure.
thanks everybody for coming.
My pleasure.
Would you be able to share your presentation with us, and then I can email it
Yeah.
out to anybody who are?
Yes.
Awesome.
Is it okay if I send it to you tomorrow?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Cool. I just need to